Hello everyone, welcome back to Chapter 3 tutorial series for our investment course, BUS 325. In this video, we're going to be looking at problem number 15, so let's read it together. It says, D-Trader opens a brokerage account and purchases 300 shares of Internet Dreams at $40 per share. She borrows $4,000 from her broker to help pay for the purchase. The interest rate on the loan is 8%. So let's highlight all of these information given, because these are all going to be information, very important information for us to figure out the solution. So 300 shares, $40 per share, 4,000 loan, and the interest on the loan is 8%. Okay. First requirement, part A. What is the margin in these accounts when she first purchases the stock? Now remember that the margin here refers to the percentage of equity, which is the money that D had contributed to the brokerage account, from the total value of that account, right? So the first thing we want to do here is to figure out the total value and figure out the capital or the equity that D had contributed, and then find out how much does it represent from the total account, right? So the total value of the account is going to be the number of shares multiplied by the price per share, right? So that's going to be $40 multiplied by 300 shares. Okay. Go to our calculator, 40 multiplied by 300, and that's going to be $12,000. Okay. Now, we already know how much D had borrowed. So now we can take the total value of the account, we subtract how much D had borrowed, which is the 4,000, and we get her equity, right? So we'll call it, let's write it as a formula first. Initial equity is going to equal total value minus the borrowed value. Okay, that means it's going to be $12,000 minus $4,000. That means the initial equity is $8,000. Okay. So to answer the question, what is the margin in these accounts when she first purchases the stock? The margin is going to be, let's call it the initial margin, is going to equal the equity, or the initial equity specifically, divided by the total value. Okay, which is going to be 8,000 divided by 12,000. 8,000 divided by 12,000, and that would be 66.67%. All right, so that's the answer to the first part, part A. Now let's go back and see part B. And now, of course, before we start with part B, just to make sure that we are all on the same page, what's happening here is that D-Trader opens a brokerage account and invests in a specific stock, but not all of the money is contributed by her. Some of the amount is borrowed by the broker or from the broker, right? So if we want to represent this maybe in a portfolio, perhaps we can do a circle like this, okay, and around approximately here, maybe like so. This part here represents these equity, and this component, and of course this is 66.67%, and this is the broker's loan, okay, which is going to represent the remaining percentage. I'll just go 100 minus the previous answer. So 100 minus 66.67. That's 33.33%. Okay? Now this amount here is $4,000, and this amount here is $8,000. Right? Okay, we'll keep that in mind for now. Now let's go to Part B. Part B says, if the share price falls to $30 per share by the end of the year, so I'm going to highlight both of these, so $30 per share by the end of the year, what is the remaining margin in her account? Okay, going back to our sketch here, this portfolio completely is $12,000, right? Now, if the stock contained in that portfolio drops in price, that means this amount is going to decrease, right? Who bears the brunt of that reduction in the value of the portfolio? The investor himself. This party or this partner here is not really a partner. They're just lending the investor some money, right? So they do not share the profits or the losses. They just lend the money, and then they get some interest in exchange for lending the investor that money to fund his portfolio. Okay? So that means if this value decreases, it's all going to be taken down from this component right here. This component is completely protected from the downside and the upside. Okay? So now, knowing that the share had dropped in price from $40 to $30, we can the first thing we need to do is to calculate the new total value of the account, right? So I'll write down here the new total value of the account, which is going to be equal to $30 this time, multiplied by the same number of shares, which is 300 shares, which is going to equal $9,000. Okay, so that means the portfolio total value had dropped from 12,000 all the way down to 9,000. Okay, it says what is the remaining margin in her account? Now we want to show two things: the effect of the drop in price, okay, which is reflected in the reduction of the total value of the portfolio, and also we want to show the effect of interest that should be paid to the loan, because the key word here, it says that by the end of the year. So that means the investor will also have to pay this interest on this borrowed amount. Okay? So now we want to find the total owed to the broker. We found the total value of the portfolio after the price reduction. Now we want to see how much the investor would owe to the broker. And we're going to follow the following formula. We'll take the principal of the loan and then multiply it by 1 plus the interest rate. Okay. What was the principal? It was $4,000. This is the amount that the investor had borrowed from the broker, multiplied by 1 plus the interest rate, which is 8%, so 0.08. Okay, go to the calculator, $4,000 multiplied by 1.08, and that would be $4,320. Okay. Now, from these two pieces of information, we can find the remaining equity in the account for D-Trader, right? The remaining let's find the equity first, the remaining equity. Sorry. Is going to equal the total value of the portfolio, which is $9,000, minus the amount owed to the broker. So that's 4,320. Okay? And that will give us $4,680. Okay? From there, we can calculate the remaining margin. So the remaining margin on the position here is going to equal the equity in the account divided by total value of accounts. Okay, which is going to equal 4,680 divided by $9,000. 4,680 divided by 9,000, that's 0.52, which is equal to 52%. Okay, so that's the first question in requirement B. There was another part as well. Here it says, if the maintenance margin requirement is 30%, will she receive a margin call? Okay. Now to answer this, we need to determine, is the remaining margin on the position higher or lower than the MMR or the maintenance margin requirements? Okay. And of course here 52 is more, or it's greater than the 30%, right? So we could say the remaining margin equal 52% is greater than the MMR of 30%. Thus, D will not receive a margin call. Remember, the investor only receives a margin call when the remaining margin in the account drops below the MMR, drops below the maintenance margin requirements. Okay, so that's the answer to part B. Now let's go back and see part C, the last requirement. It says, what is the rate of return on her investment? Now that's easy. We know the key information that we need to calculate the rate of return. The rate of return is calculated through the following formula for a margin account. So rate of return equals the ending equity minus the initial equity all divided by the initial equity. Okay? So what was the ending equity? We already figured out all the components here. The ending equity was right here. The remaining equity, 4,680. And the initial equity was 8,000, right? We did calculate it in the first part, right here. So now, the ending equity, 4,680 minus the initial equity of 8,000, all divided by the initial equity, which is 8,000. Go back to our calculator. 4,680 minus 8,000 divided by 8,000. And the answer here would be minus 0.415, which is equal to minus 41.5%. Now it's very important that you indicate the negative sign here because it shows that the return was actually negative. That indicates a loss instead of a profit. Okay? Now just for good measure, just to make sure that you understand, we'll go back here to our graph. Notice how the rate of return was relatively high, even though that the drop in price does not represent the same magnitude, right? The reason being is that this is a leveraged account. Okay, so this is investing on margin. So going back to this graph here, let's reimagine the scenario. This is not required in the question. I'm just giving you this piece of information as an extra piece to make sure that you understand this question. Let's reimagine the scenario and assume that D has actually invested the whole $12,000 from her own money, right? So in that scenario, what would be the rate of return? Okay, so if we neglect this part, we assume they did not borrow any funds, right? How do I calculate this? Again, I'll use the same formula, but this time the amounts will be different. Okay, so I'll write this in yellow because this is extra. Remember, this is not required in the question. So rate of return with no leverage. So no borrowing. Okay. This is going to equal the initial equity, which was, sorry, the ending equity, which was the amount, and which is this time is going to be represented by the total value, the ending total value of the account, which was 8,000. Is it, or 9,000? Sorry. Right, we did calculate it before. Yes, right here. So 9,000. This will represent the ending equity. Because remember, in this scenario, she's paying everything from her own money. So if the stock drops down in price from 40 to 30, it's going to be 30 multiplied by 300 shares, right? Which is 9,000. Minus the initial equity, which was the total value of the portfolio at the beginning, which was $12,000. Okay, again divided by $12,000. Go to the calculator, key in the numbers, 9,000 minus 12,000 divided by 12,000, and we get a negative 0.25, which is equal to a negative 25%. Okay, so if there was no leverage in this account, the rate of return would have been only 25% decline, right? But because of the existence of leverage, notice how that increased the loss magnitude from only 25% decrease to a 41.5% loss. All right. I hope that you found this video useful. As always, please remember to write down any questions that you might have. I'll try my best to answer all of your comments. And until I see you in another tutorial, keep on learning, and I wish you the best of luck.